never gets old.
That was such a good one. And an ice cube. So,
I love that for you.
I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Justina.
This is Coffee at the Cocoon.
And we're actually drinking coffee this time.
We're sorry if you can tell. Okay, so what are you drinking today other than just coffee?
I'm drinking iced coffee with white chocolate.
Yes.
Like a white chocolate iced coffee.
We are white chocolate girlies.
I am. And I love like berries in my coffee, right? Like raspberry, blackberry,
yes,
things like that. Coffee shop was out of it today.
I know. They had raspberry though.
Rude.
Yeah, and I have the cold foam today.
You fancy.
I love
fancy
foam.
person.
So good. Yes, I have cold brew, white chocolate, raspberry. So good.
So good.
So, as always, trigger warning. We will be talking about things that maybe some people are uncomfortable about, and that is okay.
Yeah.
Don't listen if that's your case.
Absolutely. So. Just take care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Which is what we're actually going to talk about today. So, like, maybe this is the podcast for you today.
Right.
Because, last month, I almost said semester. Last month was Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So I know everyone here is taking a deep breath of relief because we did a lot last month. So in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, we are doing some self-care stuff today.
Yeah.
So,
and I think what we have today is interesting because it's not just like the stereotypical take a bubble bath self-care.
Nope.
Talking a little bit about resiliency, what that means, talking about how community care plays a part and how, individuals heal and recover from trauma and mental health symptoms, and it's gonna be a good one.
All the things. Yeah, because there's nothing that makes me more angry than when people are like, well, just like go take a bubble bath. I'm like, I hate baths. That's not my thing. Like, I don't want to.
I'm not a human soup person.
Right. No, I don't like it. So yeah, no, we are not going to tell you what to do to take care of yourself. We're going to talk about different ways that you need to consider taking care of your whole being. So, I guess first you kind of mentioned this already, and I wonder, can you give us a very short description of what resilience means to you?
So resilience to me is essentially the idea of how someone is able to adapt and overcome really challenging circumstances throughout their lifetime. So I think it's a little bit of a combination of, healing and bouncing back essentially after something really hard has happened. In our situation here at the Cocoon, it's most typically we're, working with individuals who have experienced trauma, interpersonal violence, and things like that. So that's kind of where that lands for me. What about you?
Yeah. I always teach my kids, it's you go through some hard stuff and you learn something and then you are able to adapt in the future, right? I might use some different words when I talk to them, but yes, that is the short way of explaining it to my kids. And I think a lot of times resilience is only talked about when it comes to kids, and that is something that I know we both kind of have a pet peeve about too, because we all can have resilience, and it doesn't have to just come from childhood experiences.
Absolutely. So
I definitely think that making sure we all understand that it's anyone can and does have resilience, right?
Right.
And I think one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this in a self-care discussion was because I don't think we acknowledge how much resilience we all have, even just like how much news is really unfortunate globally and also locally, and just being online in general can be really traumatic. And then heaven forbid you have an in-person physical trauma, right, that has a whole nother impact on somebody.
Absolutely.
Right? So I feel like a lot of times in the mental health world we talk about like little t and big T trauma, right?
Yeah.
It all creates resilience. It all has the opportunity to have resilience. And I think that's the other thing we're going to talk about is you can have trauma and not necessarily have resilience because there's a middle piece that usually is missing. And that's really what we're going to touch on today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm definitely excited.
Yeah, me too. So I guess let's talk about that middle piece. So, unfortunately, resilience is kind of a reactionary thing, right? You unfortunately have to have something not great happen in order to have resilience. And that is something that has always frustrated me, is the phrase, like, don't let your trauma define you, right? And there's pros and cons, right? Because we don't want it to overwhelm our lives, right? But when we don't acknowledge that the trauma has given me an opportunity to learn and grow and now be more adaptable in different situations, it's not seeing me as a whole person with all of my experiences.
Right. And I'm so glad you bring that up. And I know we talked about this earlier when we were talking about getting ready to film today, that I've been watching The Legend of Korra.
Yeah.
And this was something that was literally on the episode I was watching last night.
Yeah.
So, like, no spoilers, or at least as little spoilers as possible. You know, so Korra is this avatar figure, and she has the weight of the world and balancing the world and the spiritual world and all of these things, right? And goes through trial after trial after trial, and, you know, experiences these traumas, like, repetitively. And they use this reference as, like, trauma being like a poisonous ink inside of her that has to, you know, be taken out. And so we go through this process of watching her go through trying to heal and trying to better herself and get back to the avatar that she was before. But at the end of this one episode, she's facing her most recent challenge face, you know, head on, her nemesis, head on. And she's like, this is what's gonna be the factor that heals me. This is what's gonna change. And that's not it. Yeah. You know, she has to learn that these really, really awful things happen to her, and that she is forever going to be changed. And it's about how we adapt going on, you know? Yep. It's really beautiful. Yeah. Like, it's, the whole show is really good, but that's a really beautiful moment.
Well, and it brings up a really interesting concept too, that, like, I know a lot of folks that I've worked with in the past, and, you know, people close to me that have gone through trauma, one of the reasons that they sometimes can't see the resilience they've built is because they're still stuck in that trauma. Yes. Right? So if it's ongoing or things like that, it's really, really hard to see how you've been able to adapt. Right? Yeah. And sometimes that resilience and that adaptability, once we're out of that traumatic situation, is actually not good, right? Like, sometimes the ways that we've had to cope in the trauma are not helpful when we're not in the trauma.
Yeah. Right? And I think with that too, like, yes, we experience trauma and we have to go through this process. Some people it's faster than others. And it can be a really prolonged process. And I don't necessarily care for the phrasing that healing isn't linear, but it really isn't. You know, anything can set that back. There can be, you know, hiccups, you know, any of those things. But, you know, it can be a relatively long process for individuals to even start bouncing back even after they're out of that situation.
Yep. And not only long distance, but ongoing, right? It's not a one and done, like, well, I'm better today. Like, it's not how it works. Right? Like, I wish there was just a magic wand that after a trauma we were like, well, you're healed. Like, no, that's just, it's just not how it works, you know? And it's an everyday thing, right? Like, even once resilience is built, it has to be maintained, right? And so that middle piece that I think we both agree is usually missing when someone is struggling with resilience is this like, growth and healing, and what that actually looks like. Because, again, a lot of things in this world tell us, like, well, just go get your nails, especially, and it's also, like, very feminine based, right? And, like, personally, that really just makes me mad, because men deserve self-care too. Non-binary people deserve self-care too. What? There are women that aren't feminine that deserve self-care too. So, like, when we only talk about getting our nails done and going shopping and going and getting a bubble bath, that excludes a lot of people and then makes them feel like they don't deserve to take care of themselves.
Absolutely.
So I think maybe we can talk about, like, I know we have, like, 5 different things we're going to hit on, but I think just, like, talking about how there's a culture of self-care that is not inclusive, first of all, right, and also does not touch on all of these 5 things, right? And I think that we live in a culture that promotes self-care so much that it's actually devaluing it, you know?
I totally agree with that statement.
Yeah. And I also think it has become capitalized on. Well, just buy a yoga mat, get a water bottle, like buy this
Well,
app.
and especially after like the extreme crisis part of the pandemic that we went through in 2020, you know, oh, you know what? You love doing yoga. You need to stretch because we're all stressed.
Right.
Come buy this really expensive yoga mat.
Yep.
You'll definitely feel better.
Subscribe,
take care of yourself.
Right. Subscribe to this thing that teaches you how to blah, 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 right? Like,
yes.
There is so much of self-care that is just about gratitude, that is just about, you know what, I am really happy that I can stand up today. I am really happy that I can get into my bathtub to take a shower, right? Like, sometimes it's that simple. It's not always the act of doing things, but it's the intention behind it.
Right. There's so much, like, it's so, what's the word I'm looking for? Not artificial, but like superficial.
Yes.
Like, right. Especially the self-care industry.
Right. Right.
It's really not truly meeting anybody's needs. It's just making a buck for a nice bath bomb.
Yes, exactly. And it also, I feel like, for those folks that don't have traditional coping skills, it also devalues those. So maybe watching TV is a healthy and relaxing coping skill for one person. And that is wonderful and good, and it can teach you things.
Yeah.
And for somebody else, it's a way for them to remove themselves from the world, and it can turn into a spiral of never leaving the couch. Right? And so just like with anything, there's a dosing aspect as well, where it needs to be best fit for the person, and it needs to be something that means something to them.
Yeah.
Right?
And I also think it's important too, because I think what ends up happening, or at least has happened to me, is that like, oh, I found something that worked for me, and then life changed, stressors got different, I got older, whatever, and then that didn't work for me anymore, and then feeling defeated, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do this? Why isn't this helping?
Right.
And then just kind of cycling in this like angst of I need self-care, but coloring's not doing it anymore, or whatever.
And feeling like, so now what? Like, this is the one thing that helped, so now what do I do? Right? And I think that's, I've heard a very common concern is like, okay, so like you said, this huge stressor has now come up. Coloring it's not gonna change it. It's not gonna make me feel that much better. But if I can color and listen to music, if I can color outside while listening, right? Like, kind of adding to it and piling on. Yeah. You know, like, as the stress piles on, sometimes we gotta kind of stack our coping skills as well, you know?
Yeah. And the way that I think it has been commercialized is also, you know, that you have to spend a bunch of money on it, and that it's just another to-do list, like another task on that to-do list for you, and like that isn't helpful either.
No, and it also shouldn't feel like a chore. Like, it should be something that is inherently motivating to you, right? Like, if you told me right now to learn how to skydive and that would help me fix my emotional whatever, I'd be like, screw you, I'm not doing it, right? Like, you just can't pay me to do it, right? Whereas, you know, somebody who doesn't know how to do crocheting and I tell them to do that when it's something that helps me a lot, that's not going to help them, right? So it definitely has to be something that doesn't feel like an extra task, probably can be built into your day, right? Like, it's not going to take extra time or energy, right?
Right.
And it's something that you already enjoy doing, or is something you've wanted to try, right? So I guess that kind of gets us into like the 5 things, like the 5 areas that need to be touched on in order to have a holistic view of self-care. So do you want to share those with us? What are the 5 areas we need to encompass?
Yes, I will name them.
Okay.
What order they'll be in is a whole other story.
I won't hold you to it.
So we've got our physical element, our mental element, emotional, spiritual. Is that 4?
That's 4. We have 5.
Then
social. Good job.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's fine. It takes a village.
Yes. And that's also what we're going to talk about, is that community care is something that is really lacking, right?
Yes.
That social aspect is really what most people struggle with, especially after COVID, right? Where we weren't allowed to see each other face to face. We weren't allowed to spend time with each other. We already live in a society that says when you're feeling a certain way, be alone, and that's the only way to fix it, right? Self-care does not mean be alone.
Yeah.
Right? And so I really tend to prefer the phrase community care, because even if I'm not with somebody, I can help them take care of themselves. And in turn, that is helping me take care of myself, right? Mm-hmm. There's some study that says like complimenting somebody else gives you just as much serotonin as somebody complimenting you, right? So it's that back and forth. It's that, that village, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say that social aspect is something that a lot of people don't really grasp, because especially in this world, we think of social as social media, right? And sometimes that is the opposite of self-care.
Yeah, and even on that same spectrum, I think we also think of like, oh, if you're gonna be social, you need to go out to the bar, you need to go clubbing, you need to be like in big groups of people.
Yep.
And like that's not everybody's vibe.
Yep. Some of the best like social self-care I get is my partner and I will go over to one of our best friend's house, and we will sit in silence, crochet together, and watch a very silly something or other, right? Yeah. And that is my social self-care. Are we talking about what I'm dealing with? Absolutely not. That's just not how I process things, is in that group, right? But like being with other people, doing something that I love, and just being able to fully relax is something that helps me a lot, right? And I think because that is not something that someone can capitalize on, we don't do it enough, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, I definitely think that social aspect is something that we need to focus more on. I also think society can capitalize on that physical and emotional piece, right? Emotional, go to therapy. Well, money, money. Physical, well, just get a gym membership. Well, maybe I don't have goals of working out or anything like that, but you still have to find a way to take a lap around the house. Yeah. Stand up, bend down, touch your toes, right? Like even just having an intentional movement throughout your day can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Right?
And like even during the peak crisis of COVID, my spouse and I, we would go on just like short walks just in our little block of neighborhood 6, 7, 8 times, where the neighbors were like, what are these crazy people doing? You're not wrong.
Listen, but I can't sit in my house any longer. Can't do it.
I cannot.
No.
So,
and especially if we're talking about building resilience and moving on from trauma, there's also a lot of research that says that rhythmic movement changes the body chemistry when you're in a traumatic space, right? Yeah. And so any sort of like dancing, yoga, walking, something that has a rhythm to it. Even, again, I crochet a lot. Like that has a rhythm to it, right?
Yeah.
And it does. It changes the way your brain can process things.
Right. And that's even things like one of my good friends, she does like the interactive podcasts where they're like telling a story as you go on a walk or a run.
Yep.
Some of them are like more scary horror themed. Some of them are like fairies and like going through the forest, like cute stuff, right? Yeah. But like based off of the mood that she's in, the vibe, or like whatever she's trying to accomplish that day, she just pops her headphones in, she goes on that walk and listens to the story and follows the prompts,
Yep. And again, I also think self-care can come across as like, you need to do this because you're having a bad day, right? Yes. I was just talking to somebody about this the other day. If we only practice self-care when we're having a bad day, we don't know how to have it when we're not having a bad day.
Yeah. Right? I just kept thinking of that TikTok sound where it's like going on that stupid walk or stupid mental health, and it's like got that bot behind it. Like it's funny and it's true.
Yeah.
Because it's something you have to start implementing into a schedule, a regular thing.
Right.
But if you only do it when you're feeling bad, it's likely you're not going to carry it out long term.
Right. And self-care takes practice, right? It like a lot of times we think of it as a reactionary thing, right? And it needs to be more proactive. Where like, I'm going to do self-care every day, and I'm a hypocrite, but I'm going to do self-care every day so that way when something comes up, one, I'm more prepared for it, so it doesn't affect me as deeply, and also I now know what to do to make me feel better or differently because I've practiced it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that is also a big piece of it. And personally, I don't like being told what to do. So like scheduling things, very difficult. But building it into my day doesn't feel as like regimented, right? So like every day in the shower, I do a couple stretches, right? Rolling my shoulders. It's sometimes it's that simple, and it can be that small, right? But I also want to point out that, the spiritual aspect of self-care can be a bit daunting or traumatic in and of itself for some people, or just frustrating because, again, I think there are a lot of opinions about religion, and that is not what we're talking about. We are talking about your sole purpose, right? Having meaning in your life. And again, because of the reaction of like holding it at arm's length, we don't always talk about it or appreciate that aspect of self-care.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I think it kind of goes back to that whole idea of complimenting someone else also benefits me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And not that everything needs to benefit us, but we're human.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we need to, again, there needs to be kind of an intrinsic motivation, right? So, like, if I know that helping others makes me feel better, I'm going to be more motivated to help others.
Yeah.
Right? And so, volunteering, baking cookies for your coworkers, it can be very simple, or it can be as extravagant as you're able to make it. But, like, spiritual is more about what makes me feel good about my existence on this planet.
Yeah. And I think that, a number of people do find that through religion, through
Absolutely.
faith,
Absolutely.
And that's totally fine, as well. I think that we oftentimes get caught up on both ends of the spectrum of that you have to be this very religious, devout individual to have spiritual meaning or like spiritual balance, or, vice versa on the other end. You have to keep it at arm's length. You can't talk about it.
And we need to find some middle ground.
Yeah.
Because, you and I had talked about this, but I do think that social and the spiritual aspect is what usually holds people back from seeing the resilience that they have, or even building resilience, right? Because if we're only working on our physical and mental and emotional health, we're still missing some pieces, right? And then the last thing is just the mental, is the idea that we're challenging ourselves in a healthy and fun way, right? I think sometimes I rely too heavily on this one, where I'm like, I don't know how to do this. I should just try it, right? And it's like having a way, those small wins, right? Feeling accomplished in little ways. So trying a new recipe and cooking it for dinner, trying a different way of dressing yourself, like even sometimes I get ridiculous, but like brushing your teeth with your left hand, right? If you're right-handed, and brushing your, it can be something that small with the intention of challenging yourself, either knowing that you're going to fail or hoping that you're going to succeed, right? Because those mind changes, those thought processes can help you overcome those little T and big T traumas easier and recover quicker, right?
Absolutely.
So how does this all tie back to interpersonal violence and what you see self-care helping survivors overcome?
It's a loaded question.
How much longer?
Well, I think we see this in a number of ways. So when individuals are experiencing actively or have experienced traumas, specifically like interpersonal violence, a number of those 5 elements are in some way shattered. Having a sense of self-worth, what your purpose in life is, not having trust in others, and oftentimes being isolated and secluded by, from loved ones and systems that are meant to help serve you, due to the cycles of violence and abuses that are common tactics.
Right.
So when we talk about individuals overcoming trauma, I think something that we oftentimes get kind of overwhelmed with is just focusing on the trauma. What happened? How did we get here? And I think that oftentimes that is sometimes fueled too by the fact that survivors are trying to understand their situation.
Absolutely. And rightfully so.
Right. Because sometimes finding the patterns, finding root causes, understanding that there, are, the circle of power and control, things like that helps people heal and conceptualize what, terrible thing has just recently happened to them or happened to them in their lifetime. But we get stuck in that. And so
we only do that.
Yes.
Right? Because it needs to be an and.
Right.
Right? Not an or, but an and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when we are working with survivors, especially those who are out of their situation, are ready to start moving forward into their healing process and, going back into gaining some of their independence and autonomy. I feel like it's anemone. Anemone.
Their independence.
Their independence. Coffee hasn't hit yet. But as they're, trying to regain their independence, they oftentimes just feel like they're hitting a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when we start having conversations about better understanding resilience and resiliency, as it is another one of those big popular buzzwords over the last 4 or 5 years, and these unrealistic expectations of what resiliency is and how to get that through self-care and all the things that we've just talked about, they just feel defeated. And so I think that by having more enduring and intentional conversations around resiliency, ensuring that we're talking about that there is that and it's not one or the other, is an important step into empowering not only a survivor to heal, but a community to make change that is going to be beneficial long term and to help prevent violence from occurring in the first place.
Yep. Yeah. And I like that you mentioned the community aspect because, as you said, when somebody is dealing with interpersonal violence, so many of those 5 pieces of self-care, like you said, are shattered, right? So if you only had friends together, if you went to church together, if you went and did this activity together, that can now be triggering, right? Like maybe you're on a bowling league and you don't feel like you can ever bowl again, even though that's the thing that makes you feel your best, right? Yeah. And so I definitely think finding a community that can help you rebuild those coping skills without losing what matters to you, right? But that's hard and that's difficult. And that's where the Cocoon can help.
Just put a little plug in there.
I mean, this is Coffee at the Cocoon, you know.
But no, there really is a way to not only empower a community to help and support survivors of interpersonal violence in better ways, but just to improve the quality of living.
Absolutely.
Right? Like we don't often, I feel like we don't talk a lot about, not only is there the social impact on communities that violence has, but there's a financial cost. There's all of these things that, whether or not someone knows that it's happening behind closed doors, is impacting your community directly. And so we can make an empowered community that won't tolerate violence. And create systems that are actually helpful in more ways than one, even outside of the scope of interpersonal violence advocacy.
Yep. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think where that really starts is just having real conversations around those impacts, right? Yeah. Because I don't think that people understand how impactful interpersonal violence is on a community.
Yes.
Right?
I don't know the exact number, but on average, both for domestic violence and sexual violence, it typically costs a community anywhere from it's like $100,000 to $120,000.
I was gonna say it's over $100,000
per survivor. So that's not,
and I think it's per survivor per year.
Per year, yes.
Yeah.
And so I hate that sometimes I have to use that number to justify to some individuals, like, why should I care?
Right.
Well, it impacts you.
Right.
How does it impact me? I don't see it. I don't hear it. No, but
it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Yep, it's all around you. Yeah.
And that's a mind-blowing number that every year, and that doesn't include, that's just one person. So if it's a family, it is astronomical.
It's astronomical. And what I, kind of to tie this back to, self-care, but also just like you said, like wellness and having a high quality of life, right? If you are dealing with something personally and you take that out or react in a way that impacts somebody else, and then that causes them to react to somebody else, right? It's this trickle-down effect.
It is.
Right? So if I go to the coffee shop and I order my coffee and I am grumpy as heck and I am rude to them, and then they are now rude to the next customer because I was rude to them, and then, right? Like it just keeps on going. Yeah. So even the emotional toll on a community, I think we all know what it feels like to walk into a space where the culture is unwell, right? And so if I know for me, sometimes self-care feels very selfish. So if you can view self-care as a way of healing your community by healing yourself, if that's what motivates you,
right,
do it. Because I think sometimes it's very hard not to feel selfish when we're told, like, take time for yourself. If you're a parent, that's not possible. But you can't be alone. You're very rarely alone if you're a parent, right? So taking time to yourself can feel very selfish. If you're not a parent, you're probably involved in a lot of things and maybe don't have time to feel like you can take care of yourself.
Right. Like even using the two of us as examples, like students.
Right.
Like it's hard.
It is extremely hard. And like you said, a lot of common ways that people try to promote self-care or social environments are not always rooted in wellness. Yes. Right? So if the only social events you are going to are partying and drinking and feeling burnt out from social environments, then that's not really helping you any, right? And so it can also feel, like you were saying about folks that are survivors of interpersonal violence, almost alienating when we try to move away from those, typical aspects of our environment.
Yeah.
So how do we wrap this up, man? Like, I feel like we could talk about this all day.
We
could. Well, I think, first of all, just really figuring out what matters to you probably is the first thing, right? And figuring out what makes you feel a certain way. Because not having that awareness is going to be probably the biggest barrier, right? And then really deciding what is a priority to you. Because the idea that we don't have the time or the energy just means that we're prioritizing something else. And in certain times, that might be what needs to happen. Yeah. And then in other times, reevaluating that and saying, okay, I do have the time and energy, and I'm going to make a conscious effort to prioritize this. Right. Right. So I think that is my advice to folks. Yeah. How are you feeling?
Pretty similar. I just think that it's really important that we start engaging those who hold power positions and those who are active in our communities to start prioritizing community care and to really understand what resiliency is, and I think just trying to give ourselves some grace, especially those who are survivors or are struggling with something in some capacity, give yourself grace, but also let's get you the care that you need to meet your goals in the long run. Yeah. Like I said, I could just ramble on.
Yeah, we both could because we talk about it a lot. And also we talk about it at the Cocoon in general, right? Because thankfully, our staff really, really prioritizes self-care and community care. Yeah. Almost everything we do has an aspect of how are you doing? What are you doing to take care of yourself? I don't know how many times a day I tell Justina, what did you eat for lunch? What are we doing? We need to go do something, right? Not to call anybody out.
But that's a part of it too, is holding each other accountable.
It's the culture,
right? It is a cultural piece.
And I know we are both very appreciative of the culture here and how we all look out for each other, right? So I would say find your community, find the people that'll do that for you, and keep them around. So. Yeah.
And don't be afraid to explore.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, on that note,
to keep this from rolling on and on.
Cheers. Till next time. Almost finished my whole coffee.
Me too. I was like, I gotta stop.